Transmission start. Welcome to Where Did the Road Go? Join us as we wander off the path and explore lost history, consciousness, the paranormal, unexplained mysteries, alternative thought, and much more. We are present on the web at wheredidtheroadgo.com. Now here is your host, Soraya.
Welcome to this edition of Where Did the Road Go? And this week, I have on with me the author of John A. Keel, The Man, the Myths, and the Ongoing Mysteries, Mr. Brent Raynes. How you doing, Brent?
I'm doing fine, thank you. Thank you for having me on your show.
Yeah, I found out about you actually from Adam, whose conference you're going to be at on the, is it the 18th?
The 19th.
19th,
Saturday.
yes, of October. And that's the Strange Realities Conference in Tennessee, in Nashville, Tennessee, to be exact.
Yes, Music City.
You're going to be talking about some of the stuff in this book, right?
Well, actually, I came along a little too late. He had already booked up all the speakers, but he said I could be on the 8 o'clock discussion panel. And
okay.
I'll be there to, I'll have a little vending table and have copies of my material, my books, and early copies of my magazine, and some used books to sell to anyone who might be interested.
Nice. So how did you get into researching like Forteana and stuff?
Well, initially it was strictly UFOs. I was a teenager. I had read Frank Edwards' Flying Saucers Serious Business, so I started out just strictly on the UFO nuts and bolts end of it. Mm-hmm. And about age 14, January 1967, a lot of water under the bridge, I decided I was going to start collecting all the information I could get my hands on, start reading, magazines, books, start acquiring, and whatever material I could. And pretty soon I started a little mimeograph newsletter and started mailing to people. And I started writing to different people in the field. Lucius Farish, who was well known to many of the old timers, I think, out in Plummerville, Arkansas. He was the one that started the UFO conference, Eureka Springs UFO conference, that still goes on each year around April. And Lauren Coleman was actually my abominable snowman consultant back then. He later lived out in Decatur, Illinois. Now he lives up in Portland, Maine. He's changed location on us.
Yeah.
But I was, but it was, I didn't go into all the 14 paranormal areas cryptid until later on, after a couple of years, I guess, and reading especially John Keel and his thoughts, and even before his Operation Trojan Horse and Strange Creatures from Time and Space that came out in 1970. I'd been reading his magazine articles in Saga and Mail magazine and a lot of men's magazines that he wrote articles, and reading about, his alternative ideas, what he called the ultra-terrestrials, being an Earth-based intelligence from like a parallel world, as opposed necessarily to an extraterrestrial explanation. And I found his ideas intriguing, stimulating, and so in October of '69, I actually started correspondence with Mr. Keel, and he actually wrote back, and I know he used to write about how he was irritated with troublesome teenage UFO buffs, and I was certainly a teenager at the time, so I always tried to write these real mature, adult-sounding letters to him, but I think he probably knew, but anyway, I started this newsletter I had for a few years there called Sauceritis Review, and I would send him copies, and he would send me this newsletter he put out for UFO students called Anomaly. And so we exchanged newsletters in the mail, and he also would write me letters. One time he wrote me a 3-page letter, single space, on his typewriter. I was just amazed that he took the time to do that. But I had asked him some questions, and he answered every one of them and added a little more detail to it, Huh. So anyway, that was how I got started in it. back in those days, we didn't have the internet, so I would actually. My dad didn't like me using the telephone at the house, running up his phone bill. So I would just
Hmm.
get a bunch of coins. I'd go to a phone booth somewhere, and I'd call. I'd read some story about someone in another state in a magazine, UFO magazine. That back then newsstands used to carry UFO magazines. Now it's all pretty much internet that you find information on. But I would call an operator and try to track people down, and then I'd put the coins in and call somebody up and start asking them questions. And that's write letters to people. And it was kind of surprising the number of people who actually would take the time to answer questions and to even send drawings. Even Steve Michalik, the guy up in Canada that had the encounter with the landed craft. He was a prospector, and he was burned by this craft. He actually sent me a nice little letter and drew by hand the craft that he had seen, the little dome disc type object that he said he claimed he was burned by. And even I know that case has always seemed credible to a lot of people in the field. And there's a book that recently came out that was co-written by his son and another UFO researcher up in Canada. And anyway, that's how I got in this crazy field. Anyway.
And how many books do you have now?
Well, I have 3 that I've written. Visitors from Hidden Realms in 2004 was my first book, and it tries to take kind of a comprehensive global historical perspective of UFO contact type situations, including some Native American, indigenous people, shamanism, making comparative analysis or evaluation on some of the data. And then in 2009, my book On the Edge of Reality, which was interviews largely with a lot of different researchers and experts in different areas of the field, be it the paranormal, shamanic things, quantum physics, and so on. But at the core, examining the UFO enigma from different angles, different perspectives. And of course, my latest, which just came out on Amazon on July 14th, the John Keel book.
Yeah. And what made you want to write the John Keel book? I mean, other than the fact that he was a huge inspiration, like, where did you come up with the idea to put this together?
Well, that's a good question. I didn't originally set out to, but I think that I've been following in his footsteps through the years, and I've been corresponding with a lot of people about him. And I know that one time I was talking to a researcher, and she complained to me, says, just every other sentence you keep mentioning John Keel. Don't you have an original thought of your own? So I said, yeah. And I've been, I do, but he was such an inspiration. And so anyway, I just got the idea a couple of years ago that, I could actually write a book on John Keel, give a little of his biographical background, how he got involved, tell about him, and interview people who knew him. And at the same time, I could describe, the influence he had on many people, the influence he had on me, and, John A. Keel, the man, the myth, and the ongoing mysteries. That's the part that's ongoing. I mean, he's influenced so many of us in the field all over the world. I know people, that I've been in touch with in Germany, Australia, Sweden, Brazil, who have been hugely influenced by Keel and their own, work in the field. And I thought, this would be a good thing to put out there. I mean, I've got data I'd like people to, I've questioned over and pondered over, and I've presented it to different people. And I thought, why not put all this in a book and let a wider audience ponder, what Keel said and some of these new things that we're looking at, the elements of anomalies with consciousness and physics that more and more people are coming to examine. They back in Keel's day, this was this was all very, very controversial and kind of wild woo-woo sounding, and
Right.
now more and more people are really into it. I think if he were still alive today and writing, that he would find that he would have a more, receptive audience.
Yeah, him and Jacques Vallée were so far ahead of the curve on this stuff. It's only now that their work is being taken seriously by a wider group of people, it seems.
Yeah, in the beginning, he even felt that, Jacques Vallée and Dr. J.L. and Hynek, who were both close friends, of each other, that they didn't quite get his work. But he said eventually Vallée come right up along, expressing many ideas very similar to his own. And he would joke from time to time about he was actually Vallée's ghostwriter. But and I met Dr. Hynek at his home in September of 1972. And I got to spend, I guess, half an hour, 45 minutes, whatever time he could afford to devote to talking to this young man that was in the Navy at the time, going to the Great Lakes Naval Training Academy nearby. And so I just bought his book, which he autographed, The UFO Experience, that had just come out at the time. And I was surprised when we got to the subject of John Keel that he said that he found him very interesting. He was very intrigued by his ideas. I expected when I brought up his name that he would kind of, poo-poo. But I noticed that often more privately than real openly, he would, from time to time, as the years, progressed, that he did talk and ponder some of the strange aspects of the UFO experience.
Yeah.
And I know there was a lady in Brazil told me that she had actually met him, and they had a little private talk, and said he was very open to the quantum physics aspects, other dimensions.
I think if you look at this stuff long enough and you're intellectually honest, you have to kind of look at this stuff in a wider scope.
Yeah, and I think that's certainly what happened, with Hynek and Vallée coming over from France, and from the way I remember it, in 1963, they first met, and Vallée was introducing him to the wave in France in 1954, all those contacts, being sightings and stuff, close encounters. There was a fantastic wave that France had back then. And of course, that was, his home turf originally.
Right.
And he introduced, till then, Hynek had just been exposed to the information that came from the Air Force, and landings and being encounters were considered hoaxes or delusions and often go to the back of the file, or if they went anywhere at all. So Hynek was telling him he had been investigating this stuff, and some of that evidence was pretty compelling. So then Hynek did start to take more serious interest. And of course, in 1964, he, took the Socorro, New Mexico case seriously, with the patrolman there that said he'd seen a craft on the ground take off that had two beings initially standing near it. Whatever the merits of that story were, he certainly began to take those and others more seriously.
Mm-hmm.
So,
now one of the things that people will sometimes say is that Keel exaggerated or blew up things to make them seem more impressive than they actually were. Did you find that was the case when you researched this stuff?
Well, I did talk to, make a connection with Daniel. Excuse me for having a lapse of memory here. For just let me collect my thoughts here. Shoot.
Names always escape me when I need them.
Yes, that's unfortunately.
I'll have it if I don't need it.
Yes, and that name is Drazen.
Okay.
Daniel Drazen. He was with Keel. He's a filmmaker, and he's been in this for a long, long time. And he met Keel in New York, and they, he he wanted to meet Keel, met him at one of his talks because he had had a UFO sighting at one time, wanted to talk to him, and in the conversation, Keel was telling him about his investigations down in Point Pleasant, West Virginia, the UFO activity, the Mothman creature, the people were reporting very anomalous stuff. And so he accompanied Keel down there, met the reporter, Mary Hyre, who's, of course, mentioned in Mothman prophecies and all, and as well as other people, some of the witnesses. And he actually saw some anomalous things in the skies himself. He would actually go out and sky watch. He would go into the TNT area where so much of this activity had occurred, the first really compelling Mothman incident from December 1967. He went into the 66. He went into the TNT area at night, would sky watch, but he said he always had the Route 62 out there, always within sight, just in case something did happen, and he wanted to make a getaway.
Yeah.
And he said even John Keel carried around a handgun when he went into the old power plant, just in case Mothman showed up for him too.
If it would even be effective on him.
But yeah, there was. He said that Keel kind of, he had a flair. He had a real good way of making kind of taking dramatic license and really putting you on the edge of your seat, so to speak. I mean, he was part of the Writers Guild and wrote screenplays for like Lost in Space, Get Smart, and all that. So the guy knew how to write. And he said that even though sometimes, he add that little flair to it, he was always very factual. And so I go with that there. Also, there was a gentleman who came all the way from Sweden who helped Keel with some of the material from Sweden for his book, Operation Trojan Horse. And he spent several weeks in 1969, 1970 in Point Pleasant. He came to the United States, went to Point Pleasant and West Virginia, and he talked with approximately 30 of the witnesses, and also got to know Mary Hyre as well, the local reporters, a stringer for the Athens Messenger, and she was on top of all these reports, UFOs, the Mothman, whatever anomalous stuff that was going on, including the MIB. Mm-hmm. And so he was actually very involved in documenting, and there was an interview that I use in the book that was actually published 2 years prior to John Keel's The Mothman Prophecies, that tells a great deal of the powerful traumatic effect these experiences had on many of the witnesses, and some of the unusual poltergeist effects and things that happen, and the effects of the eyes having kind of a shining hypnotic effect on the people. And that's certainly worth visiting right there. I got to go to Point Pleasant myself back in May of 1976. It was nearly 10 years after all this ruckus had started up, and everybody spoke very favorably that I met of Keel, and felt that he was quite professional and very knowledgeable about the subject. And I met Linda Scarberry, who I was surprised to discover not only had the experience in the TNT area with her husband Roger and another couple back in '66, but she said, hundreds of other episodes. And she described one where she said she was within 3-4 feet looking at it through a apartment window, and it was had these non-blinking eyes that kind of bulged about out of its head, I think maybe 1.5 inches, and then was about 2 inches wide and glowed red. And she said that she wants to see it every time anybody mentions going to the TNT area to look for it or whatever. But when she actually has the encounters, she just becomes like frozen, speechless, can't really do anything. She says when you see it, you're just too frightened
Now, you talk about trance states accompanying a lot of these experiences. Do you think it's that they're too frightened or that they're in sort of a trance?
Well, it almost, it's of course the fear element's got to play in to
Hmm.
someone seeing something like this. But I know I talked with someone else that's mentioned in Keel's book when I was there in '76, a Virginia Thomas, and she said she had seen something. Now, this wasn't a typical Mothman type thing, and people were seeing other weird cryptids too, or whatever name you want to give them. Keel simply called them monsters, but it was. She said 6, 7 feet tall, gray-colored, man-like figure running across the field like lightning. And she said their eyes became fixed on it. She couldn't take her eyes off it, and her ears were making a popping sound like the air pressure had changed. Said there was a sound coming from it like a broken fan belt. And she thought, in reflecting on it, she said, "Oh, I think it was a robot."
Mm.
Very peculiar. And some of the people would describe the Mothman as just extending its wings out, and then it would just shoot up. Wouldn't flap its wings, just extend them out, and then it would just like become airborne. And Keel did mention that two of his witnesses described as the thing flew overhead, that it made kind of a mechanical type noise. So, we got a really strange bird here. It became originally people called it the bird, and then some newspaper reporter called it Mothman because it was at the time Batman was popular. So
Hmm.
this this newspaper writer thought it would be kind of cool to call it Mothman, and well, the name kind of stuck. But a lot of the people that Keel found that had these experiences, about half of them was some kind of creature, Mothman or whatever it was. He found that about half of them reported psychic sensitivity. A number of the Mothman witnesses, and the guy from Sweden verified this too, Aki Branson, that they had like peculiar poltergeist type experiences. Noisy ghost.
Right.
Yeah, it's so. I mean, that's the thing. I mean, he was studying also the contact experiences, which wasn't that popular back then. A lot of your major researchers like NICAP, the National Investigations Committee on Aerial Phenomena, a respected civilian group investigating, the UFO phenomena, but they only wanted reports of the craft. Once someone reported seeing a being or it landed, they thought that became a little too controversial. They just wanted good sightings of the. So you see how far we come. I mean, Keel
Yeah.
reported. He wrote an article for True Magazine back in February '67. It was published, called "Never Mind the Saucer. Did you see the guys who were driving?" And because nobody else was hardly addressing this, and he gets a call from the editor, and he goes down to the office, and the guy waves him to a corner, tells him he's got some mail. He says he's got about 6 mail bags there for him with thousands of letters from people with contact experiences and missing time. And so I figured this is where Keel, when he describes in Operation Trojan Horse, how you know, which was published in 1970, that he had connected with like over 200 silent contactees, people whose stories had never been publicized before. This is where a lot of his contacts were made. It was through this
Yeah.
tremendous amount of mail that he got. He even estimated in that book that there might be as many as 50,000, he guessed, experiences across the United States. And then, in 1987, we had Bud Hopkins, Whitley Strieber wrote, Strieber was Communion and Hopkins
Yeah.
was Intruders. And then suddenly mainstream ufology took a deeper interest in these stories. They were the abduction phenomena. And they started support groups and things. But Keel really was the head of the pack. He was studying this stuff, missing time and all that, before it was really a popular thing to do so.
Now there's a quote you had from Keel in there that I've heard before, where he said that some of the exaggerations were not him; they were the people who were printing his books or editing his books, changing stuff or typing things into his work.
Yeah, early on, I had written to him because I was hearing, these claims about, the errors he was making.
Hmm.
And he wrote me back and explained that, like with some of the errors in his Operation Trojan Horse, that he'd been given the galleys and made corrections, and yet the publisher still went ahead and printed it without his corrections being, and then in his anomaly, he would newsletter, he would point out some things that again was beyond his control, but he wanted to set the record straight.
Yeah.
In fact, he would quote some other source and then find out the other source that information had been incorrect. And in one case, he'd actually heard from the witness and learned that the name had been misspelled and corrected some of the other details directly from the witness who was, writing to him. So, and then there was a researcher friend of his. There's some incident that was supposed to have happened years ago in Pennsylvania, and this guy lived in Pennsylvania, so he went to the newspaper, microfiles, and found out that instead of Pennsylvania, a similar story was in the paper about such an incident that happened in Indiana. So, it was a whole different state. And sometimes there were things that totally reversed the meaning, like invisible became visible and such. So, I mean,
yeah, that's weird.
Which, things that changed the meaning, but
yeah, completely.
Completely, yeah. And of course, nowadays with the way we can publish books, we simply put it in a file, send it on, and self-publishing. You do it yourself. You make a mistake, it's your fault.
That's true. Now, one of the things you mentioned that I thought was interesting in his article, Purple Lights and April Foolishness, he talks about being out looking for UFOs, and the moon hadn't come up that night. And someone else had pointed out later that he had the moonrise time wrong, and it actually came up a few minutes after he had left. And what struck me about that is that Keel wasn't lying. The moon didn't come up. He just had the time wrong.
Right. He was going by some newspaper that he said had said it was going to come up at an earlier time, and if he had stuck around just a little longer, he would have seen the moon come up. But he'd had some. He claimed to me that he had some agent who wanted a book on the Mothman come out, and it had been several years since he really had dealt with that. He'd kind of moved on, but they wanted him to write a book on the Mothman, which he decided to go ahead and do, even though he complained afterwards that it was a commercial flop at the time. But he had all this stuff packed away, all these notes and affidavits and clippings and things in a suitcase, and he dug it out and he put together the Mothman prophecies. And I was just in touch, by the way, as an interesting little footnote, with a friend of his, Doug Skinner, who lives in New York City. And he tells me that he has that suitcase to this day. It's still in his closet.
Mm-hmm.
He's got John Keel's old suitcase that he has all those notes from which he wrote the Mothman prophecies from.
And he's the one that runs the John Keel website, right?
Right, the johnkeel.com website, which you can go down through this list of several years, month by month, and check all these different entries that he has, which has letters that Keel wrote and pictures, newspaper clippings and stuff from years ago. And in fact, I just wrote to Doug and told him I'd send him some copies of letters that Keel had written me years ago, and if he wanted to use them.
Oh, nice.
But anyway, yeah, that was the deal. Excuse me a moment. I got a tickle in my throat.
Well, there's a story you talk about that got left out of the Mothman prophecies, and that's when his friend Big Joe came to see him. You want to talk about that for a moment?
Sure. That kind of surprised me. I actually was in touch with someone who didn't want to be named, but he's quite credible, and he said that he was there at the Keel's apartment when he met the guy. He said he was a big guy with a powerful handshake, and he didn't think anything of it. Keel didn't think anything of it. It was the night that the collapse of the Silver Bridge was reported, on the television,
Mm-hmm.
and that was a very significant time for Keel. Things were kind of coming together. He was realizing, to him, it showed that there wasn't an intelligence that knew certain things were going to happen before they did. He was upset that the intelligence didn't seem to really try to help him and others to stop something bad from happening, like, warn people about. He knew something was supposed to happen on the river, the Ohio River, but he didn't know what it was. And then this happened, and he decided it was the bridge. And anyway, this gentleman spent several hours with him. They even went out to eat, and he was there in the apartment when this came over the TV, the announcement. And they also went to a Jim Moseley UFO talk. And I've tried to find out if anybody might have pictures from that talk, because anytime there's a meeting, back then or today, there are going to be pictures. And I thought, wow, but anyway, he hadn't seen this guy in years, who had been a real good friend, been his best man at his wedding years ago. And sometime later, he meets the guy's wife in Macy's and department store. And he says, "Oh, I saw your husband a while back." And he proceeds to tell her when, they met, and she proceeds to tell him that that's impossible. He died over 2 years earlier in July 1965. And Keel makes the mistake. He's so amazed. He says, "Are you sure?" And she's, gets rather upset and says, "Don't you think I would know? I was there, And so Keel realized he had a real mystery, and he told my informant that, he had many sleepless nights after that, because, Keel was a lifelong atheist, and he just couldn't bring himself to believe that, he was actually talking to a dead person. He said, but it was amazing because the guy looked exactly like him, had his memories down to a T, his voice, everything. He suspected nothing unusual at the time. And he also talked to my friends about this incident back in 2003 at the Mothman Festival, Tim and John Frick. And, they got to talking about this particular incident. He revealed to them, and one of them, it was Tim, said something to Keel about, well, wow, what do you think about that? And Keel said, it hurts my head too much to think about it much at all. And that was pretty bizarre.
Well, Ann Strieber had made the comment that whatever this stuff is has something to do with the dead, because she noticed so many people would have contact with dead friends and family members, including Whitley, in his December 26th abduction, which he never talked about either because he thought it was too fantastical.
Yeah, and I thought, wow, I really thought it should have been something that he, you would have thought it would have come out of the Mothman prophecies, but he just didn't feel like it fit. And I know sometimes you'd be writing to Keel and he would mention something, and he'll say, just keep this to yourself, that I have the UFO buffs riled up enough over this and that. There's no sense in, generating any more hysteria. And so I guess he just felt that this was going to, it was better to leave this out. But when I found this out as I was putting the book together, I decided it's time to tell this story, whatever it means, whatever it,
Yeah.
Because the guy had shared with me a copy of the letter that Keel had written to him about this. And as I say, they were They had become longtime friends, and he was there that evening when the guy came into the apartment.
Wow. Did any of the people who saw the Mothman die in the bridge collapse?
I'm Yes, I'm going to say I don't know how many. I know there was 46 total number that
Right.
have reported that have died. And I do remember Keel writing in the Mothman Prophecies that some of those people that he had interviewed did pass away in the bridge collapse later. I don't know just how many that was, but
Okay. I was just curious. Um, let's talk a little bit about Derenberger. And Keel was suspicious of him at first.
yeah, Woodrow Derenberger, who he had the famous Indrid Coal encounter when he was returning to his home in West Virginia from actually Ohio. It was a rainy night, and all of a sudden, this craft came down and landed in the road, blocking, him from passing it. And this man came out with a big grin on his face and came over to his truck window. And he was Woodrow Derenberger was a salesman with he had sewing machines and such. And anyway, began to tell him about wanted to know where you're going and claimed to be from space.
Mm-hmm.
And what made the account appealing to Keel was that other people had come forward claiming that they had passed by and seen a guy talking to someone in a truck on the side of the road, that people had seen a craft. There were two other witnesses Keel had learned about. I think he spoke with on the phone, but they didn't want to be interviewed. They didn't want their names in the magazine, who claimed that they had had an experience with a landed craft or something like that. And I know there was a woman who described she had been driving by around that time and saw a craft, and there was some teenage boy reported seeing something too, I think shining a beam of light. If Anyway, all this is in the book. If I've
Right.
if I'm a little off on any of the details, but it was pretty well impressive. I think that Keel felt afterwards that maybe he might have started to exaggerate some of the stories and got sort of spotlight fear, got into the limelight, and was became maybe a bit of a storyteller. But I know I've talked to his daughter, who's still alive, and she remembers. She says the meeting Indrid Coal, because supposedly some guy claiming to be Indrid Coal and some of the family members came around the house later, and she remembers when the police came and interviewed him the night after his encounter, and she was supposed to go right to bed, but she kind of got on the stairs and kind of eavesdropped and watched things, and claims that the men in black came too, and she actually saw them talking to her father. So anyway, but then there was that college student in Maryland who called in to a Washington, D.C. radio station when Woodrow Derenberger was telling his story, and the guy thought, well, I'll just call and just make a prank call and tell him, I know you're telling the truth. I've been to that planet too, and what he didn't count on is the fact that the radio station had a kind of a caller ID, and they called him back, wanted to know more. So the story kept, getting more and more exaggerated. And by the time Keel, a few months later, got down to Maryland to interview him, he'd already told his story to a number of different people. And he said that Keel grilled him for about 2 hours. He had to really be on his toes. And Keel was skeptical. He went over his story backwards and forwards. And But then he mentioned something just off, the top of his head about seeing some Buick following him. And Keel said, well, I just had a report of a very similar incident not too far from here. And according to this, then college student, that was what convinced Keel that he was on the level. And so Keel wrote his story up, and I'm sure much to his regret later,
Yeah.
in his book. And as I pointed out in my book, that's one of those things we all run the risk of as we investigate, is that sooner or later we're going to come across someone who's going to tell a story that may be lying to us. I mean,
Yeah.
So,
Well,
but yeah,
my policy with that has always been I would rather believe someone who's lying to me than not believe someone who's telling me the truth.
yeah, I think, the whole thing was that these incidents were going on for quite some time. Keel took the initiative to investigate them, found strong indications that, there was really something to it. And, if he did go overboard at all, it was, he had his reasons for pursuing it as diligently as he did. And, he was at least looking at the evidence instead of, ignoring it as so many others had done at that time. And so, anyway, that's how the ball bounces.
Well, let's talk about some of Keel's own personal experiences. He experienced, I mean, obviously in the Mothman prophecies, he did see some UFOs and stuff. He never saw the actual Mothman, right?
Right. He did skywatch. He would find a high hilltop that gave him a good view, I think around Galapagos Ferry, and which is just a short distance from Point Pleasant. And he could, see the surrounding area, the landscape, the Ohio River. And he would actually see these lights flying down close to the river. And then the boats out in the river would shine spotlights on him, and they would jump out of the way. And he went down and talked to some of the riverboat people, and they said, oh, this has been going on for years. And then, Keel got himself a flashlight and started shining at these things. Sometimes you'd shine, flash Morse code at it. One time, Morse code for land, and the thing actually came down. I believe Mary Hire was a witness to that. And then sometimes they would jump out of the beam of his light. And then probably the most spectacular sighting he had was April the 3rd, 1967. Mary Hire had just left him. So he was sitting there alone. And it was, I think, about 2:30 in the morning. And he said all of a sudden this big dome disc craft came flying by his car while he's sitting there listening to the Long John Neville radio show out of New York City. Excuse me. Which was the Art Bell of that time. And he's just sitting in the front seat of his car, chewing on a candy bar. And all of a sudden, this amazing craft with these flashing lights comes flying by and appears to come down in a nearby ravine. And at that point, he locks all the doors, and he says, here I am, a guy who is used to, prowling spooky areas, cemeteries late at night. And all of a sudden he said, I just was very scared. I was worried that little men were going to come out of the bush there and protest. Are you the crazy guy who's been flashing lights at us?
I wonder about the Morse code thing, like how much that connect. I mean, because you would think an alien society wouldn't understand Morse code. So what does that suggest about the connection between consciousness and these things?
Well, that was a time too. We had a lot of reports. I remember a guy from Keel, New Hampshire, had reports of people flashing their flashlights at craft or lights, and they would respond. I remember a lot of reports being published around that time of people doing that. So I'm sure that's where Keel probably got the idea to do that himself. And so it's certainly it was an interactive thing to many of the witnesses, including Keel.
Yeah, but like just responding is one thing, but actually responding to like a Morse code message and actually dropping down seems like it would imply some connection between our consciousness and them.
Yeah, and I think that's again, Keel felt that the UFO phenomenon should have been a branch of parapsychology because there was so many anomalous elements of consciousness and paraphysics or whatever involved in so many of these situations. And the following day, where he had thought he had seen this craft come down, he had the police up there, and they had a Geiger counter checking out the ground because he thought it had actually landed. And they couldn't find any trace evidence. They couldn't get anything detected on the Geiger counter. But he said that the something strange, a gibberish voice, came through the police car radio, and it sounded like a high-speeded phonograph record type thing. And said when that happened, it was actually turned off, but yet it came through the speakers. And there was a policeman nearby who had interviewed the two young couples back in November of '66 when that spectacular first Mothman case had hit came to actually bring people's attention to this so-called Mothman thing. And he said that as he was interviewing them, that same sound came through his police radio. And so anyway, that was kind of an interesting anomaly there.
I remember Keel at some point talking about getting flashes of light. I think he said it only happened when he moved. He would get flashes of light like someone set off a flash bulb, but there was nobody around.
Yeah, there was, and he felt like maybe that was an element of some sort of consciousness, maybe something going on in the brain, and it was coming across as a flash.
Right.
There were a number of contact experiences who were describing at the beginning of their experience to be this anomalous bright flash of light. And I think some of your Marian apparitions, the same type of thing. And in fact, I remember right off the top of my head, the John Reeves case of Brooksville, Florida, involved a flash where he was telling people, I think maybe it took a picture of me because there was this flash of light when we got up face to face.
Yeah.
But
and I've had that happen before as well, and it's one of those incidents was connected with an Earth light type of manifestation, where I was getting a bunch of those flashes. So I always wonder if it's something coming from the Earth. But when he was talking about it, he's talking about like he'd be in his apartment and that would happen. And he said, I think that it was always when he was moving, and it struck me that moving's kind of a liminal thing, so you're more likely to have that type of weirdness coming about when you're, changing things.
Mm-hmm. That's a good point. Well, now that you mentioned that, so were these flashes coming from the light that you saw?
No.
Or they just
it looked the whole landscape would light up. It had nothing to do with the light, but the light was there too in a place that there's no lights, in the middle of a field.
Okay.
Yeah. One of the strangest things that ever happened to me.
Wow.
And I have a lot of strange things that have happened to me.
So now we know why you're in the field.
I've always been interested in this stuff.
Yeah.
I pretty much grew up interested in this stuff, and like I wanted to be an astronomer so I could study UFOs until I was told they don't study UFOs. So I guess I have that in common with ballet.
Yes.
I was just told that much earlier. And then I wanted to be an archaeologist because I wanted to look for lost civilizations. It was told they don't really do that either. And it's like, oh, never mind then.
Well, you found your place now.
Exactly. And I found Keel from his articles in Fate magazine. And I think the first thing I picked up, because like he would be in every issue, and that would be my favorite article in Fate magazine. And so finally I went and started hunting down his books, pre-internet, obviously. And the Mothman Prophecies was the first one I found, and then I think Our Haunted Planet was the second. And I was just so blown away by the way he approached this stuff and his sense of humor and everything else.
Oh yeah, his humor, his acid wit, tongue-in-cheek style there he'd use, and he, in a single paragraph, he could say 2 or 3 things that would suddenly bing,
Yeah.
grab your attention, and like no other writer that I've ever encountered, really. And
the Mothman Prophecies was always one of those things where I'm like, I kind of want to make a movie out of this, but I don't do big budget movies. I do like really no budget movies. And I'm like, I wish someone would do this. And when it was finally done, I mean, you said he rejected a ton of different screenplays. But I thought the one that was done, even though it's not the book, I thought it had the perfect feel for the events. And that seems to be his opinion too, I guess.
Yeah, that was his opinion. I know a lot of people complain that it didn't follow the book, but he said that the book would have been too hard to have followed like in a 2-hour movie.
Yeah.
And so it had to be broken down to just certain basic characters and throw in all the different elements and give it the feel. And he said it recreated the feel of the experiences, the atmosphere that was part of that, that whole situation. And he did tell me, and he also wrote it in Fate magazine, that there was one thing that was in the movie that actually did happen, and that's where the telephone was plugged out of the wall and it still rung. He said that actually did happen to him.
I also think that they promoted the movie badly, like in the sense that they would use that scene about was it Richard Gere in the movie?
Mm-hmm, yeah.
Where he reaches into the nightstand and it tells him that he's holding chapstick. And if you understand the context, that's really creepy. But when you just throw that in an ad for the movie, it's like, well, that looks stupid,
Yeah, they were just trying to show that this mind reading type.
Right, and it was great in the movie, but like I'm saying, just in the promo for the movie, it came off as kind of silly,
Right.
You needed that context around it, because I think the way they presented it with that context was great. It's just they didn't do it in the movie promo because it's only a few seconds long.
Yeah. Yeah, I wish that they would have perhaps followed up even with a second one.
Yeah.
But
and I got the extended version, and there were cut scenes where they're doing the thing, flashing the lights at blobs of light in the sky, and they cut that out of the movie.
Oh, that seems like that would have been a good addition to it. But anyway.
Yeah. Oh well. At least we got to see it in the deleted scenes, because it really. Yeah. The movie didn't really touch on UFOs very much. It just had the weird, cryptid, mysterious, paranormal sort of feel to it.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. They didn't really have the UFO element in the movie itself that they showed at the theaters and later on TV. So that would have been good to have had that added, but oh well. Yeah. At least it's in the deleted.
Yeah. Now, Keel always thought this was kind of a negative phenomena.
Yeah. I try real hard to just try to look at any positive or optimistic elements. I know I talked with him on the phone one time about we were talking about Marian apparitions, and I said, "What about you're always talking about the demonic implications, the demonic-like elements. What about the angels?" And he said, those always turn sour too. And he said that he had written an open letter to researchers back in the late 60s, early 70s. Maybe you got one? I said, no, I didn't. He said, well, it was, what I said was that after, looking at this whole situation real closely, I've come to the conclusion that it doesn't have our best interests at heart. And, but I know I have a friend, Greg Little, who's
Hmm.
written a book on Native American shamanic elements, ancient sites, and of course UFOs. And
Yep.
he talks about the Native Americans in the beginning of Vision Quest. They would expect to first encounter the trickster, and the trickster, was seen as kind of a devilish figure, but at the same time, he could also be a teacher, and he could be testing your motives. Why are you, inquiring into these things, and what is your reason, and are your reasons worthy? And if they are, if you prove yourself worthy, then you may go up to a higher rung on the ladder of truth understanding. Otherwise, you may just get stuck there at the bottom rung and never
Yeah.
move forward. So maybe the trickster element is part of a teaching thing instead of just being strictly all bad.
Well, I've been saying for a while that I feel like a lot of this stuff is like a shamanic awakening that's kind of being hijacked by our culture's belief system. So someone has a contact experience with, what seems like a UFO, and then they get hypnotized, false memories are created, and so on and so forth, and it becomes this terrifying thing that they're afraid of. But anything unknown is going to be scary at first, and when you're feeding that fear into it, you got to get past that part before a more positive experience would come about. And you see grays in abduction accounts, you see grays in ayahuasca journeys, you see pictures of grays on ancient cave walls that shamans put up, which says to me that this is similar to that shamanic sort of awakening. It's just not being treated as such.
Yeah, and of course you got little men that are seen in many Native American legends and lore and
Mm-hmm.
shamanic stories, and some of it's quite similar. In fact, I saw an artistic rendering of Cherokee little people, and I thought, man, that looks like one of the Greys. They had the dark, elongated eyes,
Yeah.
and yeah, I can see a lot of similarities in a lot of those accounts, and not just Native Americans of North America, but from other cultures, the different beings. Of
Oh
course,
yeah.
Keel associated the ultra terrestrials with the occult uh, elemental beings, and some have associated them, like Rosemary Ellen Guiley, who wrote the foreword to my book. She had noted a lot of similarities between the UFO beings and the jinn, and she actually believed
Yeah.
the jinn of the Muslim tradition, were actually real beings, and there's a number of research. Gordon Crichton looked into the jinn thing very closely. He was the editor of Flying Saucer Review in England, highly respected gentleman, and Anne Druffel of California, a longtime researcher in this field, been in it since the late 50s and written a number of books. She's talked to Muslim people about their jinn experiences. She feels that there are a lot of these beings, the jinn and the elementals, and from all these different cultures, they often speak of similar beings that come from some hidden place that appear to people, and they do many of the things that the modern contact experiences describe that's being done to them. And of course, that's in the book too.
Yeah. I actually had a listener write me about the jinn, and she said that on the subject of jinns, there are different types because she's Muslim.
Mm-hmm.
Ifrit jinn that can propel themselves at great speeds across the sky, jinns that can imitate the dead, jinns that can enter objects, jinns that can shapeshift, jinns that can enter the body of people and animals. Jinns cannot alter their environment as they inhabit the same space as ours in a parallel dimension. That frustrates them as when a building or object is created in our world, it also appears in their world.
Yeah, that sounds very familiar to what Anne Druffel said and what Rosemary Guiley, her thoughts on the subject. A lot of similarities. We already talked about the people appearing as the dead,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
and the Rosemary would actually communicate, get Jin information off the ghost box. She was actually doing that, and she would hear from the Jin. I heard from the John Keel through the ghost box. I didn't expect that to happen, but it did. I would actually get his first last name a number of times, and different things that seemed rather Keel-like. But one time I asked the question, are the Jin responsible for pretending or to be these aliens from UFOs? And a male voice replied immediately, "You're an alien."
Huh.
And I told Rosemary about that, and she said, "Well, Brent, that's a typical response that you could expect from the Jin." So maybe.
Yeah, you talk about spirit boxes in here. Spirit boxes are one of those things I've always been kind of on the fence with. Like, I guess I've never seen one that convinced me beyond a shadow of a doubt that it was like actually intelligent control behind it. Because these are the boxes that scan radio frequencies, right?
Right. And they would be on continuous scan. And what I have is a digital AM FM, but I always use AM. It seems like it picks up better. And I was very skeptical, on the fence. I hardly even wanted to get on the fence at the time, but a friend of mine who was paranormal investigator and also turned out to be a contact experiencer himself had introduced me to it, and went on a number of investigations using the ghost box, and we were recording it. And I remember we were on one, and he said, "I just heard John Keel," and then heard it again and played back the audio, and sure enough, the voice said John Keel. And so it was on the 1 year anniversary of his passing, and we were going to do a session at the home of Sandy Nichols in Thompson Station up near Nashville. And I said, "If you guys don't mind, let's try to reach out to John Keel." And I think we had 3 recorders going, and had a stereo speakers hooked up to this ghost box. And so he had this well recorded, and Brett asked his spirit guide, technician, whatever you want to call him, to have John Keel say his name. Within a couple seconds, you could clearly hear this male voice say John Keel. And I've never heard John Keel in a regular radio show being talked about on an AM station,
True.
But
unless you're picking up coast to coast or something.
Yeah. But anyway, it came through John Keel. So then he asked about Bigfoot. And immediately this male voice, which some people say sounds like John Keel to them, says "smuck Bigfoot, see?" And then these 2 other voices repeat "see," like they were agreeing with this voice. And so I asked, I says, "What can you tell us about Jeddu?" And this voice says, "Jeddu, eh?" And I thought, oh, wow. So yeah. I repeated the question again, and it says, "Into the fire, into the fire." And then he's still talking, but the voice kind of fades out, and then it says, "Teach me outside." And maybe I'm just imagining too much, but I mean, Jeddu, of course, that was, his first book back in 1957 from his explorations through India and places and Egypt. And it's supposed to be a Hindi word for black magic. And I thought, what a better description of black magic than "into the fire." And as for "teach me outside," to me, that says a lot about Keel's approach. I mean, he was always about, he was always reading. He loved to read about foreign countries and adventures that he could have there, dreamed of adventures he could have. And I think "teach me outside" was maybe one of his, would be one of his,
mottos,
potential mottos. Yeah. Thanks.
And Jeddu, it took me so long to find a reasonably priced copy of that book back before it was republished. And because it was selling for a lot at one point. And I finally got it, and I was certainly not disappointed in it, even though it's not the paranormal type of stuff that he deals with in his other books, it's a really interesting exploration of the sort of tricksterism of a lot of magicians and holy men across the like Middle East and stuff.
Right, absolutely. And even though he was, he had originally thought about becoming a stage magician before he decided to become a writer, but thank goodness he became the writer instead. And
Yeah.
he always continued to practice his magic. I understand he had a an unpublished manuscript that actually describes some magic tricks that he had developed himself. And as far as I know, it's lost to the wind now. But he was recognized among many magicians as being, one of them, and he often encouraged other researchers to be aware of the magic that they're, he didn't think you should be a parapsychologist, for example, unless you knew a little bit about the tricks of the trade. And he had actually sat in, him and his literary agent, who's on the cover of my book, talking about, John Keel, Sandra Martin. They both went together to it was supposed to be a psychic demonstration that some man was going to give. And they're sitting there right up front, and there's newspaper people nearby with their cameras. And this guy stands up in front of them and proceeds to levitate this object, holding out his hands to the side. And Keel pokes Sandra and says, "We need to leave now." And so without question, she follows him out the door onto the sidewalk. And then she says, "Okay, John, what's going on?" He says, "I can take you just a few blocks down to a magic shop down here on such and such street. And I can get this kit, and in a few minutes, you'll be able to do the very same thing he was doing." He said it was nothing but a little magic trick that anybody can perform. And he says, "I didn't want us to end up with our pictures being taken and people seeing that and saying, 'Oh, look, John Keel and Sandra Martin were fooled,'
Yeah.
And he did meet with the guy who actually brought the psychic / magician up onto the stage. He was a parapsychologist, and told him, and I got this from Doug Skinner, Keel's friend, and he says you could tell the researcher wasn't too happy to get the whole rundown on this. And,
Yeah.
But, Keel told him you need to be real careful with these people, and to know some of the tricks that can be accomplished. Now, even though he learned a lot of cool things when he was over there on his journey from Egypt to Singapore, and a lot of the magic tricks that were performed on people, he at the same time became aware that there were things even John Keel couldn't explain. He was in some Buddhist temple, and there was a guy there who was supposed to call in the spirits, and there were a number of things that happened. One of the most bewildering to him was the three-legged stool that came out of a dark corner and circled him, and Keel's moving his hands around it, looking for the usual trappings, the string or something.
Mm-hmm.
And it circled him, and then went back to another corner. And afterwards, he went over and grabbed up the stool and examined it and could not explain that. And probably one of the best ones is when this holy man that he'd been seeking, and the holy man one day found him. He's out walking, and the guy says, John Keel or something, and Keel turns around, he introduces himself, and Keel's amazed. This is the guy that, he's been looking for several weeks, going to different monasteries, and he's considered a very holy man. And he demonstrates to Keel how he can read his thoughts,
Mm-hmm.
He says, "Think of something, and I'll tell you what it is." And I think one of the first things was his boots. And he says, "Come on, Mr. Keel, you can do better than that." So then Keel thinks of something else. And again, bingo, the guy gets it. And he wants to know, how can I learn to do this? And he says, "Well, it takes many, many years to do this, and told him, kind of gave him a little overview of how to do it. But it was not an easy process to accomplish.
Yeah. And that book was republished by Anomalist, right?
Yes, and they included something that wasn't in the first one. The
Yeah.
chapter about his girlfriend at the time from Germany, and they thought about getting married, but he they spent quite a bit of time together, but then eventually Doug Skinner told me that Keel brought her to New York City for a couple of weeks, and that did it. She didn't want to. I guess she
Hmm.
didn't like New York City, and that was the end of their relationship. But
Huh. Well, on the topic of like magicians, tricksters, you talk about Uri Geller in here.
yes, yeah, Uri Geller, interesting guy.
Yeah.
I don't know if Keel actually ever met him or not, but I've talked to some of the researchers, people that have met him and been impressed. And there was, back on November 30th of last year, Harvard Medical School had two doctors who were talking about people who had experienced orbs being hit by beams of light. They're doing MRI studies, which is something I've felt for a long time. I'd like to hear more about someone, seeing what's going on in the brain as
Yeah.
people are reliving these experiences. This is where really exciting discoveries could be made. And I found out these two medical doctors, Gary Nolan of Nolan Lab out of Stanford, and who's kind of been at this for a few years now, but he was called in by Christopher Kit Green, who actually back in 1972 was asked by Richard Helms, of the director of the CIA, to kind of be a handler and an overseer of operations like at Stanford, where they were going to study remote viewing and psychokinesis, like Uri Geller and Ingo Swann and others.
Hmm.
And he was skeptical. He was operated the weird desk at the CIA at Langley, and I just was amazed to think that after all these years he was still at this. He's left the CIA back in mid '80s, but he still continued to work, I think, as a consultant for different branches of the CIA or the Department of Defense and so on, and now works at a hospital up in Michigan. And wouldn't surprise me, he's still got some connection, but he he's doing a study of a little over 100 experiences, many of them military, who have been say they've been hit by beams of light, and he's got all their medical history. And he and Gary Nolan are supposed to put together eventually a big journal article, and they believe there's a part of the brain that kind of acts as an antenna for some of these people. They have seen craft. They've had kind of psychic experiences of various kinds, and I think really his awakening was working with Uri Geller, particularly in um, when Geller worked at a site about 30 miles from Stanford, Lawrence Livermore Nuclear Laboratory, where they were studying his psychokinesis. And they wanted to find out if, Geller could maybe, if there was a missile that was coming toward us, and in order to, if a psychic could, like Geller, could disable it remotely
Hmm.
and or reset the course or something.
Yeah.
And so anyway, while he was there doing the experiments, a number of things happened to the scientist. The scientist, very grounded, prestigious, grounded, people, not superstitious or anything, but suddenly two of them were thinking about quitting. And they were just these weird things, balls of light. They were reporting apparitions, a large, tall bird type thing. Uh, just weird. And then there was one experiment that Geller was doing where they got this audio that they recorded, and they couldn't understand it. Mostly it was unintelligible, but Kit Green listened to it and recognized one word, and it was the name of a classified project. And
Hmm.
he knew that none of the people working there, none of the engineers, scientists, knew about this project, and he was very disturbed to suddenly find this, recording from a kind of an EVP type thing.
Yeah.
So I
And the
believe
thing, go ahead.
I just gonna say I believe that's why that Kit Green back there in 1974 from those episodes really got interested in all this, because this was such a high strangeness situation involving top-notch, professional, capable people and very anomalous things. And it was through Geller that they became aware of it, because Geller claimed he'd seen UFOs, and
Hmm.
as a young boy been hit by a beam of light, and that's where his focus has been, on people being hit by beams of light. So anyway, that's that in a nutshell.
And Geller, I mean, my first exposure to Geller was when he was doing the TV specials, and they'd have James Randi out there running them down, and I always my first thing was that James Randi would reproduce the stuff Geller was doing with sleight of hand, and I'm like, but you didn't prove that's what Geller's doing. First of all, just because you can reproduce something doesn't mean that you've explained it. And second, like, I figure, looking at this stuff, if you're going to go on national TV live, you're probably going to fake it to make sure it works.
Oh yes, yeah. There were just too many people, and I interview Eldon Bird, who was a naval scientist, and he had done an experiment with Geller, and he had seen him in operation. He was very impressed, and
Hmm.
one time I walked into the office of a magazine publisher in New York City. It was the publisher of UFO Update, and he said that Geller had walked into his office one time, and these little pins were popping off a bulletin board and something on his desk moved. He said Geller didn't have any time to get in there and prepare
Right.
to, set something up. This just happened spontaneously, this kind of poltergeist type stuff.
Hmm. And
And
that's common with UFO witnesses.
yeah. And so this is all part of the ongoing mystery here.
But yeah, I mean, like, and you see that connection between, like, people who have real abilities and that sort of trickster sleight of hand stuff gets mixed up a lot. And once someone is seen to be faking something, they just assume that everything they've done has been faked.
Right. And it's really hard to get people that have been in the UFO field to really take that next step and consider the trickster element, the paranormal elements, because they've been so conditioned to look at this from strictly the physical nuts and bolts components. Keel used to call it the cult literature.
Mm.
That there is this high strangeness that's heavily involved, and part of the fine underpinning of this that gets so neglected. But I was interested to find that Dan Drazen, who had gone with Keel to Point Pleasant in '67, he was going to do a PBS special, and was in touch with PBS about doing this. And unfortunately, for whatever reason, PBS decided dropped the ball. Said they decided not to do it.
Yeah, that would have been interesting.
Yeah, could you imagine having the film, all that footage and the interviews of people
Yeah.
from that time? And he has continued on with strange situation. He's got a documentary you can find on YouTube online called Calling Earth, dealing with EVPs and the ITC phenomenon. In fact, it's because of that I found out how to reach him. I'd always remembered reading about Dan Drazen and in the Mothman prophecies in several places, and I saw where he was over in the Netherlands with a gentleman who had claimed some UFO experiences, claimed that he knew when crop circles were going to appear over there, and could take pictures for people of their loved ones who had passed on.
Hmm.
And Nancy Tolbert had posted this on Facebook, and she had pictures of that he had done of her brother, and had passed away, and she said it was clearly her brother. And I said, was there any chance that he could have got copies of the pictures? And she says no. And she got, I think, a little insulted, said, you don't think I'm that stupid, do you? And I say, I'm
Hmm.
sorry, I'm just asking.
Right. Yeah.
But and then I asked her about Dan Dresden. I said, is this the same one in Keel's book? And she says, I don't know, but here's his email address. Write him and find out.
Nice.
So I did. So everything just came together there, and very interesting. And
Well, I'm going to have you back to talk about more stuff in this book, because I still have a ton of stuff I want to talk to you about, both in and out of this book. There's some stuff in there you mentioned that I want to get more into too. That will probably drift a little away from the book, but the new book is John A. Keel, The Man, the Myths, and the Ongoing Mysteries, and you are Brent Raynes. And where's the best place? I assume this is available everywhere.
this it's on Amazon, and
Okay.
Alternate Perceptions. Of course, they can Google Alternate Perceptions, or they can go to apmagazine.info for the
Okay.
website. And we do an issue every month. The new one comes out the first of the month, and then it's archived, so you can read the current one, and you can go and you can check archive for years previous. And
Nice.
we have interviews and book reviews and different articles.
Okay. And you're going to be at Adam's conference, Strange Realities Conference, on what's the date again?
Uh, it'll be Saturday, October the 19th.
Okay.
This coming right up.
All right. Well, hopefully I'll have you back soon so we can, talk some more about this stuff. It's been a pleasure having you on.
Well, I enjoy it. It's not often I get to sit and talk about such weird stuff with people.
Our patrons help make this show possible, and I'd like to send an extra special thanks to all patrons pledging $10 or more. Allison Cook, Eric Hervin, Lindsay Marie Trebet,